President Johnson, esteemed faculty, family members of Western New England University, and of course our graduates, thank you for having me here today. I am incredibly honored to be able to spend this incredible celebration with you today. President Johnson asked that I share with you 3 things that we've learned at Gallup, because one of the things that we do at Gallup is we study leadership. And although we are studying leaders of today, organizations that are the best run in the world, and of course, the needs of followers, what we are working toward is developing exactly what it is that the future of leadership requires. And we found that it's these 3 things, and I was hoping that I could share them with you today. The very first one that we've learned that many of these leaders have in common, and it's also a massive need in the world today, is that the leaders of tomorrow, we need them to never stop listening. You know, it's amazing if you think throughout history how hard humanity has worked in order to be heard. You know, you think back to 1440 when humanity developed the Gutenberg press so that we could get the printed word spread everywhere. Or in 1897 when Marconi sent the first radio signal over the seas. And I think it was in 1970 when the first text message was sent. And today, billions of texts, Teams messages, and tweets are sent by humanity because humanity is desperate to be heard. But how many of them feel like they're actually being heard? You ever wondered about that? We go out into countries every single year, and 100 of them we actually conduct interviews face to face, so we can hear people's voice while we're sitting in the rooms with them. And I'll just give you 2 examples of interviews that we've done in just the past few years. One of them, we were interviewing a woman in Vietnam, and we were asking her everything about her life. We asked her about her work. We asked her about her job. And toward the end of the interview, one of the questions we asked her was, "How happy are you?" And things got really quiet. And she choked up. And she started to cry. And the woman who was actually conducting the interview said, "Sis, are you okay?" And she said, "No one has ever asked me if I'm happy or in good health." We interviewed another man in Canada. We interviewed him about his whole life, his work, how things are going at home. And at one point in the demographics, we said to him, "How old are you?" And he laughed and he said, "You know, it's funny you asked me that. Today's my birthday. And you're the only person I've heard from." But that today is the current state of loneliness. And they're not alone. Because we find that just here in the American workplace, 25% of people feel totally ignored. In fact, if you do it globally, we find that 330 million people don't have a single interaction with another human being over a 2-week period of time. Think about that. And so tomorrow's leaders, it is a demand. They need to be great listeners. And so the question is how? How do you become a great listener? And I know this because I failed at it myself. And one day I was in a room in Mongolia. I was in a yurt in Ulaanbaatar. And I watched a woman who I believe is truly a great listener. Because we were going through an interview with this young woman, and we asked her about everything in her life. And one of the questions we wanted to know is about her safety. And so the question that we asked was, in this city, in your community, do you feel safe walking alone at night? And the woman said no. Now, at that moment, I dropped the ball because I stopped listening. And I made an assumption. Because when she said she didn't feel safe walking alone at night, I thought what she meant was that she's afraid of crime. But that's because I wasn't being a good listener. And the woman next to me conducting the interview said, "What are you afraid of?" And she said back to her rabid dogs, "We have a dog problem in my community." But do you hear the difference between where I failed and where that woman that was conducting the interview succeeded? She never stopped listening. And if we're going to help solve the world's problems of tomorrow, we need leaders who never stop listening. The second point in our research of great leaders is we find that they find strength in adversity. Now, I promise you, and I hate to tell you this, but it's true, that as soon as you join the workforce and start facing some of the world's biggest challenges, and I promise you the world's challenges are getting tougher. If I'm being frank with you, when I first became CEO, there was a headline and it said, "This is the hardest time ever to run an organization." In fact, it's harder than 2020. And they're right. Because the amount of problems that the world's facing, the list keeps getting longer and longer. But in those moments of adversity, we find that the greatest leaders, they find their strength. Why? Because when a problem takes place, whether it's a moment of failure, whether it's a hardship, or whether it's haters, what they do is they have a choice. They can either let that consume them or they can let it drive them. And the best, let it drive them. And I'll give you a story, and I know this story has probably been told too many times, but I love it. And it starts with an artist. And this artist was actually hired by Universal Studios. And he drew him a cartoon. The cartoon's name, and you can Google it, was Oswald the Rabbit. Oswald the Rabbit became so successful that the studio said, "We don't want to pay you all this money anymore." And he said, "Well, too bad. I've created a really famous cartoon. What else are you going to do?" And they said, "We're going to hire your staff because we own the intellectual property and we don't need you anymore, so we can fire you." At that moment, he had a tremendous amount of adversity. Because what was he to do? So he went home, looked at his wife, and she said, "Sweetie, I'm so sorry this took place." And he said, "You know what? I swear to you, I'm going to create the greatest cartoon that has ever existed in world history." So he went into his room. I think he was there for 2 days. And he walked out, and he emerged, and he showed her a picture. And he said, "Behold, the world's greatest cartoon that the world has ever seen." And she said, "He's lovely. What's his name?" And he said, "I call him Mortimer." And she said, "I think he's wonderful, but I think he looks more like a Mickey." That was Walt Disney. But Walt Disney, instead of being consumed by negative news, he was driven by it. And in the absence of that moment, the world may have been denied arguably the greatest cartoon in world history. And those are the demands of the leadership that we need from this room to fix the world's problems of tomorrow. The last one is we need the leaders of tomorrow to find what it is that makes them great. Now, this may seem either obvious or, just an oversimplification of the obvious, but you are truly unique. And you've probably heard that a million times, but I can put math to it. And I say that because at Gallup, we actually built an algorithm in hopes that we could help people identify what it was that made them great. But do you know what surprised us the most? Was the amount of statistical outputs that are possible. We found that there are over 34 million different ways that people see the world. That's how unique you are. But if you can't find what it is that makes you great and build on those amazing strengths, then the world will be denied your great gifts on how you can help change this world. And I'll tell you just one last story, and I think, again, this is one of my favorite ones, and it's a story actually my grandfather used to tell us. And it's a twist of one of Mark Twain's last stories that he wrote. And it's about a historian. And this historian focused on one thing. He wanted to know who is the greatest general of all time. So he studied Napoleon, he studied Caesar, he studied General Patton, General Colin Powell, all looking for one thing: who was the greatest of them all? Well, he never got his answer, and he died. And he went to the pearly gates of heaven. And while he was there, he saw St. Michael, and St. Michael knew what was going on, and he approached him, and he said, "I spent my entire life looking for who it was that was the greatest general of all time. Please give me the answer. And St. Michael smiled at him and he pointed across the room and he said, it's that man right there. And he said, that's impossible. It cannot be that man. That man was never a general. In fact, he lived on my street. That man was a cobbler. And he said, I know. But had he been a general, he would have been the greatest general there ever was. Among us, I believe, are the world's next great generals. The next great school teachers, the next great nurses, maybe the next great president. And the world needs you to find what it is that you're the greatest in the world at, because if we're going to build the better world of tomorrow, we need you to help lead it. So graduates, if there's anything that you can help us do in the coming years, it's help us be better listeners. It's when you approach adversity, do it with strength and choose to let it drive you. And lastly, lead with your strengths, because you are so unique. And that unique contribution, I promise you, will change the world. So congratulations, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the workplace very soon. Thank you again.